Okay, right, so good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's PM Forum West Midlands webinar. This is my first one I'm hosting, so I'm very excited. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I hope that you're all well, that all your families and friends are all safe and well at this challenging time, and so really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join today's session. I'm Kirsty Sigurta. I'm the head of marketing at Barker Patel in the West Midlands, but I'm also the chair of PM Forum West Midlands Committee. I'm joined with some of my colleagues today. But today's we're also joined by Richard Miron from Earshot Strategies, and Rich is going to talk to us about the power of podcasts, probably quite a pertinent marketing topic at the moment, how it can help us reach a broader audience, how it can help us increase brand recognition and project our expertise and our message. So I won't waffle on anymore, and I'll hand over to Richard. Just one small piece of housekeeping. We can take Q&As during the session, but what I'll do is I'll wrap them all up and I'll put them to Richard at the end of today's session. So again, thanks again. Please feel free to ask questions, and if you've got any issues, just you can get in touch with us via the chat. But hand over to Richard. Thank you, Richard.
Kirsty, thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. Many thanks also to the PM Forum for inviting me to talk about this subject, which, as Kirsty said, in a way is really, really pertinent. We're talking about the spoken word. And I think the spoken word is something which is very basic to who we are as human beings. It offers us comfort. It offers us information. It's and particularly at a time at the moment where people feel quite isolated, I think words, voices, are something which is sort of part of essentials, part of who we are. So a little bit about me. I began my career very much in working sort of in the spoken word. I began my career as a trainee producer with the BBC many years ago, longer than I care to remember. I went on to become a reporter and then a foreign correspondent for a number of years at the BBC and reported from all over the place until I left the BBC after about 17 years, and I went to work as a spokesman for the United Nations in the Middle East, in sort of as a spokesman, but also in strategic communications. And from there, I moved to Washington, DC to work for the World Bank in international development, also in a position of communications, strategic communications, helping a particular unit there manage how it communicated with the outside world. When I was in Washington, and this would have been probably about 2010 or 11, the whole thing about podcasts began to happen, and the US, the East Coast of the US, was where it really started to take off. And I began to notice this as someone who had always loved radio, and I sort of sat up and took notice, because this was really about radio on demand, and there were some fantastic things happening in terms of the kind of programs that people were making. And I began to think about how could this have an application to my own work inside the World Bank. And so on the side of my regular job, I actually made a podcast for the World Bank, and the whole idea was that I would interview people who had made podcasts, who had written books on nothing to do with their work. So there was one person who'd written a book on Cambodian cuisine, another person who'd written a personal memoir about growing up before the revolution in Iran, another person who'd written a murder mystery, and so on and so on. And it became quite popular amongst staff. And from there, I decided there was something in this, and I left the World Bank and set up Earshot Strategies, which is a podcast consultancy, and I moved back to London in order to sort of take up work on that. And Earshot basically provides a range of services to people, to companies, organizations, from think tanks to very large companies in terms of training, consultation, producing, and so on. But the bottom line is, it's all about finding ways to communicate through the spoken word. That's really what I do. It's fairly simple, and it's something that I love and I feel very passionately about, and hopefully that comes through. So what I'm going to do is to talk through, I think, something of the genesis, of how podcasts have developed, why I think they work so well, and some of their commercial developments as well. And I'm also going to be talking about some of the ways in which podcasts have got an application very much for this moment in time, for where we find ourselves. So first and foremost, I trust you can all see the PowerPoint. I won't overburden you with slides, but this is the classic definition of what is a podcast. And it's very factual. It's a digital recording of a radio broadcast made available on the internet. And this is how podcasts in a way began, was that people took radio programs and they basically uploaded them as audio files onto the internet, and people could then listen to them at their leisure. What I think has happened as there's been an evolution is that you can listen to some programs which are made as radio programs and then uploaded. And then there are others which are made as podcasts, because podcasting has given birth to a whole new way of doing audio programming. It's not constrained by the same rules as as radio programs, by the same time constraints, by the same, you hear far more kind of informality, even sort of swearing and so on, because they're not bound by those same rules which bind the classic broadcasters. In fact, I say that radio is broadcasting and podcasts are narrowcasting. They're about directing a program at a particular audience. And more than anything, I term podcasts the audio campfire. It really, I think, goes back to the very root of who we are as human beings. And human beings are fundamentally social beings. And way back before there was the written word, way back before there was probably even cave paintings on walls, on the walls of caves, we would sit around the campfire or the fire and we would talk, we would exchange stories and experiences. Well, podcasts are really just that, brought up to date in the digital age. Podcasts, the aim of them is to share personal and professional experiences, and it's using it via a digital platform. And the narrative, the story, the human story has to sit at the center of the podcast for it to succeed. And more than anything, you can't say to people, well, you should listen to this podcast because it provides you with lots of information. I don't think that's the way that this works. You should want to listen to it because it tells you about a human experience. And what I try and do in my work, and as I'll come on to later on in this presentation, is to put the human experience at the center of what I do. And everything spins out from there, from the narrative. So podcasts are the audio campfire. Here I've got a selection, and there's an arbitrary selection. I mean, I listen to so many podcasts, partly for professional reasons and partly because I just kind of enjoy them. I listen to them when I'm walking the dog, when I'm out running, whenever, wherever. But this is a kind of almost like an arbitrary selection of podcasts, and I'm going to talk you through a few of them in advance and why I think some of them are really interesting. So Ear Hustle. Now, Ear Hustle was made within the boundaries of San Quentin Maximum Security Prison in the US by a radio producer who worked with prisoners. And first of all, it showed that you don't need that much to make a great podcast. You need essentially some software on the laptop, and you need a good digital recorder, and you need good voices and good stories. And the other thing about it was that you heard voices there of these prisoners who have sometimes been in prison for tens of years, voices you wouldn't traditionally hear. And that's one of the beauties, I think, of podcasts. It provides a voice to the voiceless. Now, The Moth, by contrast, it's basically straightforward storytelling. What it is people standing up in front of an audience and telling a story across a given theme. It could not be simpler. And some of these stories are, they're funny, they're sad, all sorts of things. Now, The Daily, by contrast, is a daily digest news program put out by the New York Times. The New York Times, of course, is a newspaper. But this program, The Daily, is downloaded, I think something like 40 million times a day, and it concentrates on one given story. And The Daily, they talk to one of their correspondents somewhere across the US or around the world about a particular story. Serial, by contrast, it was a 12-part documentary series, the likes of which I had never heard. And it was in a way, it was the podcast that began the podcast revolution. It achieved in the end 100 million downloads. And it told the story, it's an American podcast, about a young high school student who was murdered allegedly by her boyfriend, and he was convicted of it. And the suspicion was there was a miscarriage of justice. And it was brilliant storytelling. And it was, as the series moved through, things changed the story. So it was almost being made as it went through. And it was like watching, or rather listening to this unfolding drama. And it was incredible. Once again, Beyond Today, this takes the Today program, and it's a kind of something which is an add-on. It concentrates on one story, a bit like The Daily. And it shows how I think podcasts are slightly different. You can feel and hear the difference in atmosphere, in presentation, and so on between Beyond Today from the Today program. My Dad Wrote a Porno has become one of the great successes of British podcasting. The format, again, could be simpler. It's three people, one person whose dad wrote an erotic novel, and it became, and the other two are the comedians, and they read part of it, and it became enormously popular, and this has resulted in them taking it around the country and all sorts of things. And the last one, Teacher's Pet, tells the story of a crime that was committed, true crime that was committed in Australia, and the Australian newspaper goes to try and uncover it. And this has become very much it's very much a genre. Crime is very much a genre within podcasting. I'm just going to play you, I've kind of made a mashup. So I'm going to play you those so you can get an idea of the different styles and the different content that exists.
This is a Global Tel-Link prepaid call from
Adnan Sayed,
an inmate at a Maryland correctional facility.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial. One story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig. Remember how last time I ended by saying that the detectives had other leads in this case besides Mr. S., the guy who found Hayes' body? That they were also starting to look at Adnan? Well, the reason we know that is because of this memo.
The memo is dated 12 February 1999. It's from Detective Daryl Massey to Detective Greg McGillivray.
From the New York Times, I'm Michael Bavaro. This is The Daily. Today, the White House response to the impeachment inquiry has been to dismiss the allegations, deflect the facts, and discredit the Democrats. It's the same approach used by Republicans in 2018 to push through the Supreme Court nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. My colleagues Kate Kelly and Robin Pogrebin, the authors of The Education of Brett Kavanaugh, talked to the Republican strategist who wrote the political playbook used then and now. It's Thursday, October 10th.
Hello, I'm Matthew Price. This is Beyond Today from BBC Radio 4. Every day we ask one big question about one big story. Today, what's it like at a Brexit Party rally?
Jamie, why are we here?
We're here because my dad's written a porno.
Your dad's written a porno?
Erotic literature.
Why?
James, Alice, thanks very much for doing this with me.
No problem, Jamie.
There aren't that many people I would want to be sat around a kitchen table with reading out my dad's erotic literature.
I can't believe we made the cut.
The following podcast contains language that may not be appropriate for all listeners. We all work together inside of the media lab in San Quentin Prison where we produce Ear Hustle.
And it's all done inside the prison. I mean, the interviewing, editing, sound design.
And that's really cool, but it also is super challenging because we have limited hours we can work, we've got no internet access.
And on top of all that, prison is never a quiet place. Hold up.
We met Jim Giaccone through the 9/11 Tribute Museum back in 2013. And back then, he held his story closely. Wasn't sure if he wanted to share it or if he'd ever really be ready to share it, but we're glad and we're honored that he decided to. And he did so in front of a live Moth audience right here in New York City. Here's Jim Giaccone.
I frequently find myself in the company of other family members like myself, family members who lost a loved one on September 11th, 2001. You see, that morning, my big brother, Joe, went to work early. He worked on the 103rd floor of the North Tower for Cantor Fitzgerald. And at 8:46 in the morning, Joe disappeared into thin air.
Listeners are advised that this podcast contains coarse language and adult themes. This podcast series is brought to you by The Australian.
Lynette Dawson was reported missing by her husband, former Newtown Jets rugby league star Chris Dawson.
He said, I was going to get a hitman to kill Lynn, and he rang me and said, Lynn's gone, she isn't coming back.
I just want justice, and I'd love her little girls to know she didn't leave them.
So there you have it. And I recommend all of those podcasts if you haven't heard them. They offer some wonderful listening, some funny, some emotional, some fascinating, gripping listening, but they're great. And of course, there are many, many more. Now, podcasting has grown and is growing exponentially all over the world. In the UK, it was sort of played catch up and is still playing catch up with the development of podcasting in the United States. And here you can see the reach, how it's grown by 4% in the space of 2 years. I would imagine this slide stands from spring 2019, and that 14% figure you are going to see as being much larger now. What we have seen gradually is that, you know, podcasts by a percentage, they do increase more and more and more. The more that people hear about them, the more they pass them on, tell them to their friends, and is a sort of like a rolling snowball. And as I say, the pattern in the UK is similar to the pattern that I've seen elsewhere, from South Korea to India to Australia, Canada, and elsewhere, because they're such an accessible medium, and because, relatively speaking, the barriers to entry in terms of program making are quite low. You don't need that much in terms of equipment or necessarily, we don't need that much in terms of equipment to be able to make and to produce and to put up podcasts. Now, one of the things that I find quite interesting about podcasting is that it reverses a lot of what is the perceived wisdom about who listens and who listens to for a long time. So what the general received wisdom is that young people don't have patience. They won't stay on something that if it's not longer than a minute or two, if it's not a TikTok or a brief clip or something like that. Well, predominantly it is the younger segments of the population that are leading in terms of podcasting. 25 to 34-year-olds constitute the largest segment in the UK of those who listen to podcasts, but then you have 15 to 24-year-olds. What you are seeing is that the older segments of the population have been initially slower to find podcasts, and I think this is partly because technology technology has proven to be somewhat of a barrier to people, the fear of it and so on. But as it has become more and more ubiquitous, so people are finding that it's very easy to access their podcasts. So, of course, the way in which most people access their podcasts, and I'll come on to this, is via their smartphones. All you really need to do is sort of one tap onto a an app on your phone, on your iPhone, or on your Android. We are, I think, going to see an increasing number of the older segments of the population, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, engaging with podcasts, and we are seeing that already. And I'm going to come on to who are those people who are listening. Where do they come from in society, as it were? What demographics? And I think that's very, very interesting, because there is a notable difference between the character and nature of podcast audiences than there is to the radio audiences. So this, I think, it demonstrates that. ABC 1, that is, people who are in the higher income brackets and have higher education, are way overrepresented amongst podcasting audiences. We have seen a larger male than female split amongst podcasting audiences, but over time, looking at the United States, we are beginning to seeing that even out. Now, again, what you're seeing is with that ABC 1, in the UK, that might be represented, for example, by Radio 4, the Radio 4 audience, and that tends to be a lot older. What you're seeing is a relatively young audience who are relatively highly educated and relatively affluent. They are the decision makers quite often. And people that you, one as a business, might want to address, or stakeholders or peers or so on, that's where a lot of the podcast audiences sit. And that's, again, why I think it's quite interesting. You'll see this also reflected in the kind of podcasts that are out there. I quite often refer to podcasts as brain food. They're giving you information. I'll add there one thing, which I think is that podcasts are able to do this in a way that makes it very easy for people to receive information. I mean, just the spoken word engages the brain in a very different way than anything else, than reading, than watching videos, and it stimulates the brain in a very different way. And so people who want to get information, people who want to absorb information, or maybe they don't even want it, but they'll find them doing so unconsciously via podcasts. And I think that's one of the unique attributes of podcasts, added to which it's the only form of media that you can consume when you're doing something else. I say to people, don't try and watch a video as you're driving down the road, or read something as you're riding on your bike. I mean, podcasts are enabled to engage you in those other times, uniquely commuting, and to feed people this kind of engaging content. And this very much follows on from there. And you can see that when and where do people listen? And people sometimes say to me, well, how long should a podcast be? And I often say, well, it should be about commuting distance, depending on where you live. I live in London, so commuting distance can be like an hour. But generally speaking, I say a podcast should be about 30, 35 minutes. That's when the amount of time people will remain engaged, the amount of time that you've got them commuting. The interesting thing about podcasts, unlike radio, is that podcasts are quite a solitary thing that people do. They don't necessarily listen to them, put them on in the house and listen to them. Quite often they're listening to them on their phones with their earbuds, and that's somewhat different from radio. Now, there is demand there. There is something also that's put upon the program maker, that they have to be made of reasonably good quality. If you've got a really rattly, tinny quality, it puts people off. People are listening close up with the earbuds, and they can hear if something's not right. Now, fortunately, technology is much more forgiving these days and so on, but you have to make sure that the quality of the podcasts are good, because of the way in which people are listening and how they're listening. And of course, podcasts, you only get to hear it once. People, if they don't hear something the first time around, they're very, very rarely going to go back and listen to it again. So that's very important. But it also points to the very, very direct relationship between the listener and the person who is broadcasting or narrowcasting. It's very personal. And I think that is to the advantage. This is why podcasts can succeed very well. One of the things that we have seen, and I saw earlier, examples of generally very popular podcasts, we're seeing branded podcasts. This is where companies are understanding the value of podcasts here, value of podcasts, and using them to tell stories about what they do, and often in a tangential way. So I've got some examples here. DTR, that is actually a podcast put out by Tinder. DTR standing for data. And they tell some great stories about sort of people who, you know, about romance, about life, the stories of how people meet and so on, some disastrous dates as well that went on. But it's really good storytelling. And of course, it is a branded podcast. They're there to tell their story. Tinder is there to tell their story or its story. Now, Discovery Ventures is quite interesting. If you look up in the corner, you can see it got a British Podcast Award 2018. Where that emblem sits, once sat the emblem for Land Rover, who made this podcast. And they decided that it would be better ultimately to remove such direct branding. And the Discovery Ventures is a sort of an immersive drama which involves a whole family going on a kind of a mystery tour around Britain in, of course, their Land Rover. It's really highly produced, very, very well produced, a very good drama. But of course, there is a branded element to it, but it's very subtle and very interesting. When Life Gives You Melons, really interesting case study here by Freya Lingerie. Freya Lingerie had apparently its clientele was getting older. Sales looked like they may be declining or getting weaker, so they decided that they would use a podcast to promote their brand. And they employed Maya Jama, who's a 20-something social media star, very bubbly, and they created this podcast, When Life Gives You Melons. And it's basically hosted by Maya Jama with a number of other young female guests aimed at that 20-something female demographic. Titles of episodes included Blood, Sweat and Smears and First Loves, all sorts of things. I mean, great fun, some seriousness in there, really well produced, and Freya liked it. But you notice once again, Freya, the branding of Freya itself is way down. And just a couple of others there. UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, produced this to tell the stories of their staff, of people who went out in the field to help refugees, and it was aimed at their donor community and was very successful in that regard. And MasterCard, again there you'll see the branding very low down there, fortune favors the bold, talking about money. It was about how money, the nature of money is changing. But again, the branding for MasterCard was kept low down. The thing which always took center stage with every single one of these podcasts was the storytelling, was the production. And I think that's why, I mean, you'd listen to these partly for the joy of listening to a good podcast, and then you would discover that, you know, it was made by so-and-so. But clearly, it had a very strong marketing value for the companies behind these. And they understood, I think, exactly where they needed to put themselves in the midst of this. Now, my business sort of adopts the niche. I'm only interested in speaking to niche audiences, very small audiences. And I'm going to play you again a mashup of some of the things that I have done. So it takes, in a way, the branded one step further. And we're not looking for large numbers necessarily, but looking to direct, to make podcasts and direct them to particular groups. So we made a podcast for Crime Stoppers, all about knife crime in the UK, and went in effect around the country, holding panel discussions also with mini features. And this was aimed at policymakers, local government and others. And it had some success, got a few thousand listens, which is what the intention was. The ADB is the Asian Development Bank, and we spoke about, aimed at, again, policymakers in Asia about the future of jobs. Now, again, you can see that between two geeks. That was for the World Bank. There's no marketing for the World Bank, which is quite a sort of, I work for them, so I think I can say it, stuffy development institution, very large in Washington. And what we wanted to do is to make something fun and to engage people on the subject of data and development. And we had 2 young presenters doing this and aimed at people who worked inside development. And it was quite interesting. We knew we got to them when we got a tweet from someone sitting in a traffic jam in Algeria who worked for the United Nations saying, I'm listening to Between Two Geeks on demography, loving it, and it was a lot of fun and so on. But we took quite deliberately, we took the World Bank branding off there because we wanted people to engage with it purely on the level of it being a podcast. Think Nordic. This was for a Nordic intergovernmental organization. They wanted to talk about what they did vis-a-vis development, and we did this in terms of a panel discussion at a climate change conference in Poland, and it was aimed at a really small group. But we promoted it through paid advertising. We got 15,000 click-throughs. And 1,500 downloads, they were very, very pleased with, and we were too. It was to a very select group of policymakers in the Nordic countries. And one of the ones that we did last year was for Airbus, pioneering progress, we make it fly. And this again goes to the heart of what I was talking about earlier about telling individual stories. Airbus want to tell their story to their own workforce and to the aviation community, the people who are involved in making airplanes. And we took 8 individuals from within Airbus and we tried to tell their stories in an inventive, interesting way, walking around, going onto the airplanes which they had built and designed, or talking to the guy who landed a helicopter on the summit of Everest, the guys who were building the Mars rover that's going to go to Mars. And Future Europe, that was about for the European Development Bank, 28 different episodes, highly crafted features telling a story about a project in every country. And we did this by creating really crafted, lovely sound montages from every country, had reporters going all over Europe. And finally, Euromoney, that's traditionally been a publisher of magazines, and it shows how people are changing, and they chose to employ podcast to talk about the subject of sustainability and finance. So I'm going to just play you again a mashup of some of those examples for you to hear.
Welcome to Airbus.
Nothing was taken for granted. We were a startup, and so you had plenty of young people, dynamic, not already put into a mold of thinking, and just going out and let's do it, let's do it, let's do it.
That concludes this edition of We Make It Fly. This program was made by Earshot Strategies. Thanks for listening.
They were what I used to call my red shifts. And there's a lot of blood, isn't there, Teresa?
Yeah.
Depending how many times they've been stabbed or slashed and where the stabbing was. But they were my red shifts, and so you'd often go to bed at night and literally all you can see is red.
This podcast has been made for Crime Stoppers. Thank you to all our panel. It's been a very illuminating discussion. I'm Richard Miron, and the producer is Anouk Mier. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Between Two Geeks, the World Bank's podcast that dives into the data behind international development.
We've just had the warmest February here in Washington, D.C. on record. That's the kind of thing where I think, well, is that an anomaly? Is that just an unusual event? I mean, records will come and go. Or is it the start of a new pattern or reality? Is there something that's underlying which is making the weather here in D.C., the climate, a bit different?
L'Europe du futur. Future Europe.
So Lucina comes with an inbuilt voice. You can also upload your own voice, which is what I'd love to do eventually, is to get a nice Dublin accent on her. But at the moment she comes with an American accent and you can ask her questions. So like, Lucina, is that sore?
A little bit.
We can say, how is the pain?
Comes and goes.
She also does some more stern ones.
Don't touch me.
The mannequin can be programmed to say various things.
I want an epidural.
From the European Investment Bank.
how concerned should we be? Are robots going to take our jobs?
I would say yes, and bring it on. Over history, the data that we have shows that every time there has been a major technological innovation, it has allowed us to work less, to have a better work-life balance, and to also focus on more interesting tasks in our everyday life.
Thank you for listening. More information on the issues discussed today are available online at adb.org, and please join our conversation at #FutureOfWork.
Welcome to the Euromoney podcast series, Financing a Sustainable Planet. Episode 1, Profit Meets Purpose.
The banking sector has responded so passionately towards sustainable investments and finance. You know, we have green bonds and blue bonds and social bonds and climate bonds and sustainability bonds. There's just so much happening. But of course, the big question is it going to move the needle?
Agree that much with you that the Nordic way is the best way on all the issues because, I'm sorry. But because I think there's a lot we can learn from developing countries as well.
Please don't forget to subscribe to Think Nordic wherever you get your podcasts. You can also go to the Nordic Council's website. Thank you for listening.
So there you heard a range of examples, and we have also made podcasts for think tanks, for the European Union, for private individuals, all sorts. And it's what I'm seeing is that there is more and more understanding of the power of podcasts to deliver messages to audiences, to niche audiences, and these can be both external audiences, to be they clients, would-be clients, stakeholders, so on, the community around a given company or organization, or internal. And I'll come on to that as well, because I think that has an application at this time. Sorry. So again, bringing it to the here and now, I think it would be remiss of me to talk about podcasts and not to talk about where exactly we find ourselves in terms of around the globe being isolated. And what you can see there is that this, where we find ourselves has given a boost to the numbers of people listening to podcasts. People are looking for that contact. They're looking for, in many respects, quite literally the reassuring voice. They have more time quite often. And so you saw Acast, which is one of the major platforms there, talked about a 7% increase in global listens. And in the UK alone, 1.6 million listens of coronavirus podcasts since January 22nd. Now, there is this enormous phenomenon at the moment of people providing information, advice, so on, in relation to the coronavirus. But you're also finding all sorts of other podcasts. Now, my company, as it happens, is making a podcast about gardening because people are gardening a lot. And we're going to be putting it out to provide people with instruction about how to make the most of their garden or their windowsill or their window box or whatever, or their house plants. And you're seeing that people are hungry for this. People are hungry for content. And I don't think that this is something that is going to tail off once we're done. But the thing about podcasts is that once you try podcasts, they tend to be quite habit forming. And we do find that there is time in the day for people to listen to them. And the other thing is that they can be intrinsically kind of relaxing. And I spoke about brain food, but I remember my first days in radio being told that, you know, radio's so great because the pictures are better on radio. And there's some truth in that. I think that once people begin to engage and are engaging at this particular time, we're not going to see all of a sudden that podcasts fall away. I think what we're going to see is them solidify. The other thing is, I think that where companies find themselves, where workforces are scattered, podcasts can provide, in a way, a central meeting point, a virtual meeting point for people. They can also help to curate material. We all know, and here we are on a webinar, you can curate a webinar as opposed to going and watching, as I hopefully many people will, the 50-minute, the 1-hour webinar that we're doing here. You can curate that material into a 25-minute podcast if you so wish. So there's lots and lots of ways that podcasts can be used and are going to be used. And the terrible situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, I think is not going to mean that that the podcast listening is going to disappear once we're all hopefully can get back to our normal lives. I think it's going to continue. And I'm utterly convinced of the fact that podcasts are a media phenomenon that's here to stay. And also I would say that they serve both a commercial and a societal good. I think they're a good thing generally to have around. They provide education, information, entertainment, and it's a bit like, you remember those pictures you saw of families gathering around the radio in the days before TV. Well, people won't be gathering around them, but podcasts have become something that people really do turn to. I certainly know there are certain podcasts that I turn to for almost comfort and distraction. And in fact, I put out a whole list of podcasts. If you want diversion, distraction, go and listen to these, which have nothing to do with the current situation. So, as I say, I think this current situation, this terrible situation that we find ourselves in, is only going to confirm what's been happening over the course of the last couple of years with podcasts. So I now sort of want to draw my part to a close and to open it up as much as possible to questions from you. Anything, about how podcasts go about getting made, to trends wherever you happen to be, regional trends, or I know there are some people who have joined us from overseas, what it's going to mean for non-English language speaking territories or halfway around the world, and so on. Very happy to answer any questions the remaining time that we have.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. And we've got quite a few questions, so shall we, I'll just whiz through them now, if that's okay. So people asking really about getting started on podcasts, and right from the what tech you would suggest if you're doing a podcast to the actual content. So for professional services, that content's probably going to be a little bit dry and technical. And so any tips on how you best how you best approach that from you in terms of setting up podcast, promoting the podcast, content, style, structure, really? So sorry, it's quite a lot of questions all in one there, Richard.
No, but they're all good questions, because people often, they start in a funny way, but what tech do I need? And my question is, okay, before we get to the tech, and the tech is the easiest part of this to answer. The tech is the easiest part of this to come to terms with, right? The hardest part is to decide, you have to ask yourself certain basic questions before you start making your podcast. Why do you want to make a podcast? What gap is it filling for your organization? Who is the audience? To tightly define that, I think, is very important. What are the resources that you have? Who's going to be able to make this, and with what regularity? Because you have to make a podcast with some regularity. You can't just have one, leave it a month, then make another. It doesn't quite work like that. And what are your aims? What are your metrics for success here? Are they 100 people? Are they 1,000 people? What are they? And what's the format going to be? And how are you going to promote it? And those are questions you need to go through in a sequential manner. And it's really important that they're undergone. And in a way, I think that's the more complicated part rather than the tech. Now, the tech is really, really simple. I should have brought, but I have sitting over to one side, the kind of tape recorders that I use. And I'm going to just throw out the names there. The Zoom H4, the Zoom H6. These pieces of technology, compared to what they used to be, are not that expensive, ranging from £100 up to £300 or £400 for kind of very good tape recorders, broadcast quality. This is better than the stuff that I used to use when I was back at the BBC. And you can get free software if you so wish online. Audacity. I use something else. Everybody has their favorite platform. It's not expensive. And then you need to think about where am I going to put this? You need to have both a podcast hosting platform, and there are all sorts of providers there. And I'll just throw out the names: Podbean, Acast, Libsyn, and they provide the player in a way, how you play this out. Some people use SoundCloud. I personally don't recommend SoundCloud for all sorts of reasons. I think you want it to be on a player, but you also have to embed it, I think, within your own site, because it's your podcast, right? And you want people to come and listen to your podcast and then possibly navigate elsewhere around your own site. So it's important, the positioning of this. And then you have to think about the other attendant bits. How am I going to promote this? Am I going to send out an email to all my contacts? How am I going to coordinate this alongside my other media resources, be they social media? And I've said that podcasts can't be just a bolt-on. It has to be intrinsic to what you do, right? And so you have to promote it through your other media. It has to sit alongside the other communications and marketing efforts. There has to be a symbiosis.
Someone asked about whether you can, for me, it's part of your integrated marketing plan. So someone asked whether it's, does it take the place of webinars? Can you use webinars as well? And I guess really what you're saying is it is part of all of those comms, really, isn't it? It's not something that you would do on a standalone basis, really.
It's not. For example, I mean, podcasts can help your events, be they online events or events in person, live and have another life. So you can take your webinar and you can curate that material, as I said. So we've just done, or we're doing, an hour-long webinar, right? Then if you can take the key points of some of this and you could turn it into potentially quite a good, half hour, 20-minute, let's say 15-minute even, podcast. You could have an event where you have a number of speakers, a panel event, right? A lunchtime, we used to call them the World Bank brown bag lunches. We'd sit around, you can record that, make sure it's recorded in decent quality, and you can turn that into a podcast. You can give added life to your events. And I mean, this is often actually, fun enough, where people find themselves at the moment. In the absence of being able to do these events, people are turning to podcasts and saying, can podcasts fill that gap? And of course, podcasts can fill that gap. But when we get back to life as normal, podcasts should be that element that reinforces what you've done. And I think that's very important to think about podcasts in that way.
So you're using what like say you've had a discussion or a roundtable or an event, and you'd use your podcast to then further share some of the key messages from those events, and you're pushing out your content again, aren't you, through a different kind of medium?
But you're editing that content. You're taking, in a way, you're just taking the fat rather than, as it were, the gristle from it. And you can do it with a presenter, you can do it any number of ways you can do that, but you've got the raw material. It's a shame, it's just going to sit there. People don't often, if we're very honest about it, people don't often go back and re-listen, or re-watch rather, a webinar. But funny enough, they will re-listen to a shorter condensed version of a podcast if it's done right.
Excellent. I think that's a useful point. Probably something I hadn't appreciated, actually, thinking, oh, you've got your podcast, or you've got your webinar. Actually, you can use content from one to supplement and highlight the other. One of the questions, at the moment, obviously we're all in lockdown. If you were going to present a podcast and you had a couple of speakers and thinking, someone asked the question whether the format for a podcast is better to have several speakers, and have a two-way discussion rather than just one person talking for a period of time. So if you wanted to host something where you've got 2 or 3 speakers, is now the right time to do that if we're all remote? Is it still okay? I mean, how rough and ready does it have to be, I guess, really? And any tips on how you could refine that and do a good job of it?
Okay, I think that one person just talking for any more than a relatively short amount of time, people tend to turn off. They need variations in voice. And I even think the one-on-one interview format, you need to sometimes illustrate that. So we try and do that, even by doing certain other things. A one-on-one interview, take people on a walk, give them a different sound. We took people in Airbus through different sound acoustics. We broke up the one-on-one format. So you need to think about that. But at the particular time, it's really interesting. I'll just tell you some of the things that I've been doing here. I'm doing currently a series for the United Nations. I have one presenter in Bonn, Germany, who can't move, one presenter in Montana, in the US. I have guests everywhere, ranging from the UK to New York to Italy. And I have a producer sitting in London. And one of the things that we've done with this one is that we have sent out, each of the presenters has a mini tape, quite a cheap but good quality recorder. So they speak on the phone and they record themselves at the same time. They send that material to our producer who mixes it together. And they also speak to a guest. So the guest, we're posting out a recorder. They then disinfect it and post it onto the next interviewee for the next episode that we're doing. I've also this morning been looking, there's various technologies. There's something called Clean Feed, where you can, it's like a studio acoustic, and I'm just buying a mic at the moment, where you can have one presenter at one end of a laptop and another on the other end of a laptop. I recorded a gardening podcast yesterday, partly on Zoom, partly with me walking around my garden, showing my co-presenter, who's a gardener, what I'm growing in my own garden. I mean, one of the great things about technology and where we find ourselves is that podcast naturally lends itself to being remote, to being isolated. You don't need to come into contact with anybody. Yeah. And that particularly where we find ourselves. So it's been no barrier. I've had to be slightly inventive, and I've had to find out certain things, and we've had to employ certain tricks, but it's no barrier to making them, and in fact making them in really good quality.
Excellent, thank you. I think you're just very good at this, Richard.
No, but I just in part, I'm really not a technically minded person. My abilities don't reside with the technology. Mine are kind of like, you know, I'll say to people, oh, you know, I think this is, you know, talk through the nature of the program that they want, and talk through the ideas and how do we humanize these ideas. The technology, it really isn't, and I'm not being falsely modest, it's not rocket science.
Okay. Sounds like it to me. Someone asked whether having a script is kind of the way to go forward, really. So, you know, keeping everyone on track. I suppose you want to make sure you've got key messages if you're working with professionals. And sometimes professionals do like to talk quite a lot about what they know. So would you say script or some kind of, you know, a bit of an agenda is the way forward?
I think that podcasts lend themselves to personality. It is very hard to convey personality if you're sounding wooden and if you're reading off the page. So part of it is about saying, yes, you want to talk about various things. You want to include various subjects within that. So often what we will do is we will map out the course of the conversation, and we'll map out various bullet points. It's almost like markers. So we're going to go from there to there. And we'll often try and talk to people in advance and say, so tell me the anecdote which led to that. Where did that light bulb moment? Because we don't want people to talk about the facts and the figures and so on. We want people to try and lend the human perspective on that. So by way of example, we didn't script the Airbus one. And we tried to get people, obviously they're very corporate there. They wanted to talk about their corporate messages. I remember we spoke to the chief technical officer, who was a woman, and we wanted to know why someone like her, you know, had come to Airbus or come to be, you know, someone who builds airplanes. And she gave us the classic kind of, you know, the classic spiel about, you know, aviation and Airbus even film. We said, no, but what was your earliest memory? And she said, well, my parents tell me my first 3 words were, she came from Italy, Mama, Papa, Aeroplana. Right? And you laugh and I smile because that tells the story. And her reservation was, like a lot of corporations, like a lot of organizations, was I've got to say the right thing. But if you sound too wooden, people aren't going to listen to that. You've got to find the human element. So I don't think that you should script too much. I think you should structure, which is different, but not script.
And it has to be authentic, I guess, really, because then people won't, you know, if it doesn't sound authentic, then no one's really going to want to listen to it, are they? So, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Someone asked, in lockdown, and obviously talking about commuting, I think maybe we'd probably get caught up on the, you know, people do listen to podcasts while commuting, but obviously no one's commuting in lockdown. But for me, we've got a bit of a captive audience, haven't we, really? I guess, you know, I don't think that would be something that would put us off if you were thinking about setting up podcasts right now, that people aren't commuting, but there are still people that are out there wanting to listen to content?
I have had approaches recently from people who specifically want to set up podcasts at the moment.
Yeah.
They see that there is a time that people are, because you're not commuting, because people's days are basically odd for all of us, they're finding time to do other things and to explore other things. So there isn't that commuting time at the moment. I also think that it's, in a funny way, you can start the work now. We don't know how long we're going to be in this situation, but that work will reside. This isn't, as it were, podcasts are not just for the lockdown. Yeah. They will exist beyond it. And some quite clearly, we've seen this explosion of COVID-related podcasts, and many of them, we hope, with circumstance, will fade, because we won't need them. But the whole idea that you'll listen to something which is brain food, or something which is diverting. I mean, I've been going out and putting on my website, listening to this great comedy podcast, listen to this, this one great one called Dolly Parton's America. It's all about Dolly Parton. I'm not interested in country and western, but I really enjoyed listening to this series because it's diverting. So I do think that you can think about these things at the moment. This is a good time to be thinking about them. But think about them with an eye to the fact that they're going to exist beyond our current circumstance.
Yeah. So that content's still out there. It's not suddenly going to vanish, unless you, like you say, it will still be of reference at some point, won't it? Yes. I guess finally, probably to wrap up, promoting podcasts. Again, I'm thinking this is probably in the same way that you would promote any other kind of marketing communications, really, Richard. But any tips and suggestions on, you've got a series or you've just started podcasting, how would you suggest people start sharing that and promoting it?
First of all, look at what you have, and I referred to this. Look at your established resources. Be inventive. I mean, look at your LinkedIn presence, your Facebook presence. Also, one of the things you want to do is, if you're interviewing someone outside your organization, you can be quite strategic about that. Think about that person, who they are. Do they have a big media following? And you get them to talk about how they came on your podcast, right? So you're getting the endorsement and their followers as well. You can take the route, and we have with some podcasts, of paid advertising, be it on Facebook, which is quite good, or indeed elsewhere. And you can use various things. So we do these things, audiograms. So there's sort of clips of 15 seconds, which we have someone who's been talking, and we illustrate. We have the words subtitled and so on, so people can see these. And it's a great ad for the podcast that you're doing. It's very, very important that you think inventively and you use your network as creatively as possible. And also your network with inside. Remember, every one of your employees has a social media presence in some shape or form. Almost all of us do these days. Get people to say, share this out. Tell people to subscribe. If you're having a live event, one really good thing is to say to people, hey, everybody, get your phone. Now press subscribe on our podcast. Go to it and subscribe. By the way, one thing I didn't mention is you've got to make sure that your podcast goes on every one of what's called the podcast directory. So that means Apple Podcasts. It doesn't just sit there on your site. It goes on Spotify. It goes on Stitcher. It goes everywhere, because people listen to podcasts. They won't go to your website necessarily to hear your podcast. They will listen to your podcast wherever they get their podcasts. And you can get on those places.
Right. Super. Thank you so much, Richard. I've really enjoyed today's session. I hope that everybody who's tuned in today has enjoyed it too. And just to ask everybody to please feed in and complete their feedback forms when they're sent out to you following the event. Richard, are you happy for people to find you in the real world?
With pleasure. You'll find me earshotstrategies.com. You'll find me on LinkedIn, Richard Miron, Miron. I welcome, questions you might have. I am an evangelist. You may have gathered that, for podcasts. And even if you don't make them, just go out and listen to them, because they're great diversion at the moment, honestly.
I think we all need a bit of that right now, don't we? So
I think
thanks
we
again,
do.
everybody. You'll be able to catch these slides from Richard in the follow-up, and please do feedback. If there's anything you'd like to send socials, get involved, and thank you very much for tuning in.